Hi, everybody. So today we're going to talk about prevention and response. And what I'm trying to do is get a little bit of people's perspective and way of thinking on where we stand in the cyber world versus the physical world. Because even though we are not aware, we often tend to think about things in the way we're used to, and we're used to the physical world, right? That's where most of us at least grew up. And so try to get a little bit of understanding what's different and why we need to look at things different, and then where we should be looking in terms of prevention and response. So I want to start with this stat, which I start with now in a lot of my talks, just because I always am amazed by how many people don't know this. So when there's a major breach, right, when you read in the news about somebody being breached, ransomware, whatever, most of these breaches are not discovered by the organization that has been breached. So only 1/3 of big breaches are discovered by organizations. 2/3 come from external sources. What is external source? Well, a ransom note is external source. The FBI calling you is external source. A customer, data surfacing up in the dark net. A lot of different external sources, and they make up most of the incidents. And it's one of the things that we need to realize is that people get breached and they don't know about it, and it happens all the time. So this piece of data is from a very, very interesting and exciting report called The Cost of Data Breach that IBM publishes every year. I'm actually going to use quite a lot of bit of data from there, and I strongly recommend everybody to read it once a year when it comes out, because it really sheds light on what's going on in the world. So I want to talk a little bit about myself and why I'm the person doing this talk. Or why I wanted to do this talk. So I've been doing cybersecurity for about 30 years, most of it in AppSec, in prevention. I was a pen tester, red teamer, built products, built companies, sold companies, a lot of stuff. And after 25 years in the space, I realized that no matter what we do, we continue to get breached, right? That's the reality. No matter what we do, we continue to get breached. And I decided to start a new company that is in the response space. And so in the last 5 years, I've been in response, incident response, detection and response, all this space, predominantly around cloud, but it doesn't change the core principles. And what I discovered as I went in this space is that generally, and again, I'm generalizing, but generally as an industry, we're doing a very poor job in response. And we could do a lot better job in response and be better in security overall. So, that's the background behind this. Ever since I started this company, I wanted to do this talk, and so now it's in RSA. So, quick question. Let's go to the physical world. How many people here have had somebody broken into their house in the last 3 years? 1. In the last 10 years? 3. In the last, ever? Okay, we're maybe at 15% of the crowd here. I wanted to add a slide on how many people here had a cyber breach, but I didn't want to make anybody uncomfortable. So there's probably most of the people here were in a company that had a cyber breach in the last 10 years. So we don't get a lot of physical break-ins. We get some, but not a lot, right? And it's not because our locks are so great, right? We have locks. They generally suck. If you ever went to Black Hat or DEF CON and you went to the lock-picking village, within about an hour or 2, you can get to a level where you can pick most people's locks in this room, right? I don't know, a few years ago, I bought a new door, and it came with this latest tech lock that's super unbreakable and all that stories they tell you in marketing. And I went on YouTube to look at it, and I found this channel of a locksmith, and he makes it's like unpacking videos, only he's like unlocking a lock for the first time, picking a lock for the first time. And this super amazing locks, like very expensive lock, all the latest tech, took him 1.5 minutes in a lock he's never seen before. Obviously, after he's done it a few times, it's going to take him 30 seconds. So it's not our locks. Similarly, it's not our bars. If you've ever seen somebody who's had their bars broken into, you just tie them to a pickup and you drive away, and most of them will rip off the wall. And it's also not our Ring and Nest cameras. None of this really is the reason people don't break into our homes. So some people would ask, well, maybe we don't get broken in their homes because there's not a good, it's not a good business, right? And, we can argue that. So the average dollar loss per burglary offense is $2,600. Some of it is broken, but about $1,000 to $1,500 is loss of value. And I think I know a lot of people who, putting law aside, wouldn't mind breaking into a house to get $1,000 out of that every day, right? It's not a lot of work. We talked about it, right? Easy to pick a lock. But maybe it's low numbers. So let's look at banks, right? Why don't people break a lot into banks? And it's also not because of their amazing safes. Of course, they're much harder to break than your lock, but there's a lot more money there. But still, law aside, most safes are pretty easy to break into with the right equipment. That is, a fraction of the cost of what's inside the safe. And there are also people who are pretty good at locking, unlocking safes. By the way, great movie if you haven't seen Army of Thieves. And then we have security, but even that, again, not very hard. You could probably bribe most security people for the right amount of money. That's still a fraction of the cost, right? So I think we all understand, and it's kind of, when I talk about it, it's kind of easy to understand that what keeps us secure in life is deterrence, right? The reason people don't break into your home is because they are afraid of the law. They're afraid of being caught and going to jail. And that's why, by the way, if you go to countries where the law enforcement is not as good, you'll see a lot more physical security around their homes. Electric fences. I don't know if anybody here has been to South Africa or Brazil. It looks very different. But let's look at numbers. So this is a little bit about budget. So in the US, those are all US numbers. In the US, homes spend about $13 billion on physical security. And corporate security, so banks, retailers, shopping malls, spend about $41 billion on physical security. But we spend, a lot more, so roughly $266 billion, so more than 5 times on deterrence. So just so you get the perspective, the lock on your door is just to, make it a little harder for somebody who's thinking about it for a minute. But it's the $266 billion that we pay on deterrence that is what's keeping us safe. In the US, it's 1.4% of the GDP, or 5% of the US budget, okay? So as a country, I'm not from here, but as a country, we spend 5% on deterrence, and we'll see the numbers in cyber in a minute. But here's the problem. When we go to cyberland, the cyberspace, there is no sheriff, there is no law. And why is that? It's because it's completely global, and there are countries, certain countries, that back this up. And if you're a hacker group in Russia, maybe you need to pay something and give a cut to somebody, but you're not afraid of the law when you hack into US companies or any companies. And so North Korea, China, Russia, Iran, other countries are all supporting attacker groups. And there is no deterrence. And so we are at a point of singularity in the modern era where commercial organizations need to fight state-level supported criminals with state-level capabilities with no deterrence. So basically, we don't stand a chance, right? Because, in here, we already agreed, all our security is not very much valuable. And so are we putting a good fight? So remember the 5% budget number? So the US spends 5% on deterrence, and then maybe another 1% is on physical security. We, as an industry, spend between 0.2 to 0.9 of company revenues, so a little bit more than that because part is profit, on security, which is really, really low when you think of it. And again, those are averages. There are companies that are higher than that, but generally speaking. So we're spending about 10% on IT generally as the industry, and about 1% on security. And even when you see things like this, right? Biden makes cybersecurity top priority. So what does it mean, top priority? So we spend $266 on deterrence. We talked about it. U.S. defense budget is $850. and cybersecurity defense budget, CISA and all that stuff that's now happening, which is great, don't get me wrong, right? It's great, but it's still just 26 billion. And because of that, we're failing. So look at who gets breached. I mean, everybody gets breached, right? But also look at, MGM got breached. I think we can all agree that MGM, or casinos in general, have the best security in the world, right? They have the best physical security, any private company. And they also have really, really good cybersecurity. I've talked with some people who've been red teaming in casinos really, really hard. And yet they got breached, right? And they got breached hard, $100 million damage. Microsoft, big software company, they invented pretty much half of what's going on in secure software development. They got breached. Health, United Health, the biggest healthcare provider in the US, just got breached. So we're failing, and we're failing because we're doing the wrong thing, which is trying to think we stand a chance in prevention when we have no deterrence. What we really should be doing is thinking about it as cyber warfare, right? Because warfare is a lot more like that. People use the term cyber warfare just to discuss, nation state stuff, but we are all at a cyber war because we have no deterrence, so we're just fighting whoever is coming. And this Mao Zedong quote, without preparedness, superiority is not real superiority. And a force that is inferior but prepared can often defeat a superior enemy by a surprise attack, which is what we get all the time, right? All these breaches are surprise, not really surprise, but they're a surprise attack on what we do. So let's look at this, and if we're talking about war, let's talk about war, right? So these two dates, for those who are not familiar with them, are the two times Israel was surprised in a war. And I'm not going into politics. This is pure military discussion. And they have two things that are very in common and are also very in common with cyber. In 1973, Yom Kippur War, Israel built, or before that war, Israel built a big line of defense, right? There was a big victory in 1967. Israel occupied Sinai, and we built this great wall. It cost $300 million, which was in today's money about $2 billion, a lot of money for a small country. And it was unpenetratable, or so the army leader said. Of course, it was penetrated, because like everything that's still, people got around it. And after that, there's a lot of learning and lessons learned, and it was a really big thing in Israel history, and 50 years passed, and same story all over again, right? Different war, different border, same problem. We became, we have this great fence, we built all these electronic controls, we're amazing, and we don't need that many forces there, and again, surprise. And these are all failure of prevention conception, right? They assume that if you're big and strong, you can do prevention, and you tell yourself stories, right? The enemy is deterred, right? We're going back to deterrence. Why? We're big and strong, they're small, we'll win. The border is strong, the enemy is weak, we have intelligence, we have threat feeds, we know what's going on. And then we get surprised. And we have the same thing in cyber. We have zero trust. We build all the latest technology. We have MFA. I have this talk all the time. So now about half the incidents in the cloud start with identity. And when I tell those people, but we have MFA. Yeah, who cares? MFAs can be breached so easily, right? So we have all those things. Oh, we have questionnaires. Questionnaires are really good. They really secure us. And so we rely on prevention. We ignore response. And this is what we get. And so prevention is static. It's inherently designed to fail because the attackers are dynamic. They look for ways around the prevention. And there's always going to be a way around the prevention. Every law can be picked. Every bar can be cut. Every software can be exploited. Give me enough time, I'll do that. I don't know if you've been following the XZUtils saga from a few weeks ago, but 3 years of work a nation state put in to put a backdoor in an open source library, right? Luckily that was caught, but if they would have succeeded, we could all be easily breached. Sorry. So I want to talk a little bit about statistics around that. So, after understanding the basic concept. So the average cost of a cyber breach is $4.5 million. Again, that's back to the IBM report. What is the cost? Cost is, downtime, time invested in responding, credibility loss, all that stuff. It's about double in the US, by the way. That's overall global numbers. So 4.5 million here, 9 in the US. The average breach takes 277 days to detect and respond to. About 200 of this is detect, 77 is respond. This number goes about like 1 day up and down in the last decades. With all the technologies, we put XDRs, we put SOAR, we put all that, this still doesn't change that much. Remember, only 1/3 is being detected at all to begin with by the companies. All the rest happen in the background. And then what's really interesting that in the last couple of years, everything's now moving to the cloud. We are all moving to the cloud. The attackers are now moving to the cloud. So last year, already 82% of the breaches included a cloud component. So let's talk about risk. Hopefully everybody knows that. That's like cybersecurity 101, lesson 1. Risk is probability and impact. And this is human nature. We always want to reduce probability. Oh, I don't want this to happen. I'll put this and this and this so it doesn't happen, right? That's prevention. Prevention is focusing on probability. But what we see, and this is a really interesting stat, so 51 of the organizations increased their security budget after a breach, right? That makes sense. You got breach, you say, oh, I need to do more, I need to do better. But at the same time, 83% of the companies that were breached, that wasn't their first breach, right? So even though people are increasing their budget, they still get breached. We're not seeing a correlation here because, going back to my thesis, prevention is not working well. So if we want to reduce risk, maybe we should start looking at reducing impact. If it's given that we're going to get breached, let's focus on impact. So let's look a little bit at impact factors. Again, things that we see. So there are impact factors you can't control, right? Geography. US breaches cost more. Why? Regulation here is harder. There's more money here, generally, so everything's more expensive. Verticals. Health, FSI, financial services are more expensive. But there are things that we can control. So time to contain, I talked about that 277 number. If you go down the IBM report, there are all these cuts and slices and different ways to look at data. In all of them, you see the same thing. When this number goes lower, the impact goes lower, dramatically. Security systems complexity, on the other hand, reduces your impact. So if you start building very complex security systems, overly sophisticated, you think it's good, maybe it improves prevention in some areas, but when you have a breach, your impact will go up because now it's hard to deal with it. It's hard to manage that. Security skills shortage obviously increases impact, and migrating to the cloud, interestingly enough, increases impact, probably mostly because we have less skills in the cloud, and we understand the cloud not as well from a security perspective. Reducing impact, right? So what helps us reduce impact? So DevSecOps approach, and that's really interesting. IBM's reports going on for years. It's always have a good IR plan. That IR plan and practices was the #1 impact reducer. This year, DevSecOps approach just slightly got over that, and that's because DevSecOps approach means you have a lot of automation and a lot of processes to change your cloud environment, to remediate things, and that means that you can move faster. And moving faster, remember, time always reduces impact. Then the second one, of course, IR plan and testing. So if you have the right team, you have the capabilities, you planned for this, you can reduce impact. Reduction of mean time to contain, of course. Employee training helps with reducing impact because what happens is in big breaches, it's not one thing. They get in, they start going around. The better your employees are trained, the more likely that at some point somebody is going to notice something. and help you alert on that. Having an AR team, and I'll talk more about that in depth later, but AI threat detection and response. So AI can help a lot in sifting through the amounts of data that we need for detection and response. So going back to this just in numbers, so DevSecOps, having a good DevSecOps reduces the number, remember 4.5 million, by 1.7 million. That's a big, big number change. So by having a good DevSecOps practice and risk, probability, impact, you've reduced by 2/3. Sorry, you've reduced to 2/3, by 1/3 your impact or your risk, right? IR preparedness, 1.5 million. But then if you have a lot of complexity, you get it up by 1.5 million, right? So these are big numbers. It's not, oh, all this blabbering, I can do a little better. No, you could have a difference between a $10 million breach and a $3 million breach, or a $1 million breach, if you have the right controls in place. Yet despite all of that, and that's not new data, depends to who, but that data is available for years. Despite on that, most organizations lag on response and recovery. They're much better at prevention and protection than they are at this. This is from a Gartner survey. It shows the gap between average maturity and average importance. I didn't bring all the data, but the biggest gap in a big gap of that is in response and recover. So CISO's rated at 392 and 352, but they're almost a full score lower. That's out of 5, of course, right? Whereas in prevention, protection, they're almost the same. And why is that? Because it's our instinct. And as I said, I've been doing response for the last 5 years. People get that they need it, but it's so hard to make that decision to put more money there versus the protection, because I could prevent that breach from happening. I really want that. I don't want to deal with a breach. It's human instinct. But what we see is that, going back to this 51%, that when customers are breached and they understand what happens, and those 51% that increase their budget, they increase most of it around response. When you get a big breach, you understand that your biggest problem was response. And I see that a lot of times when people release incident response reports and the investigation response, and there's always a root cause that's somebody left something open, somebody misconfigured something, somebody forgot to patch something, and it's like, oh, how could they do this? How could they miss that? But the reality is, we have systems with thousands and tens of thousands of servers and settings and configurations. We're always going to miss something. You know what we need to not miss something? To have probably 10 times our security budget and staff, and there's no economy in there. Nobody's going to pay 10% of their budget on of a bank's budget just on information security. So we're always going to get that. Sorry, one last thing. And so, it's all, and there's a point of diminishing returns. If you're already spending 70, 80, 90% of your budget on prevention, and you take 5% of it and remove it, the impact's not going to be so big. If you move that to response, where you're maybe invested 10% of your budget, that's going to be a big impact on your response value. There's also one more thing that we've seen with some attack groups, and that is response as deterrence. And I want to try and explain this. So think a little bit about the economy of an exploit. And again, remember, hacking is a business. It's a very simple business that with ROI metrics, you'd be amazed how some of these groups run, like a very well-trained Wall Street company. So they spend time on research, finding a vulnerability or building some sort of exploit or attack, building the malware or building the code that's going to do that. They test it, usually test it on some environment, like everybody would do, and then they test it on some small organization that's not very interesting and doesn't have a lot of money, but probably doesn't have security, and they can test it. And then they started deploying it at small scale. So a lot of the attack groups, a lot of the malwares, a lot of the APTs you hear about, they started small. They started going after smaller organizations. Why? You can get money there. Nobody's ever going to notice that. Nobody has good detection and response technologies there. And then they start deploying at large scale. And then they go after the big companies. And then at some point, that piece of technology is discovered, becomes exposed, goes on threat intel, goes on VirusTotal, and it's obsolete. And now you have to start all over again. And for some of these groups, especially those that work a lot of the mid-market, if they know that you are good at detection and response, then they might not go after you. So there is a deterrence element in looking large. Anyone who's been in a park, if you see a mountain lion, look large, right? It works. It works in cyber too. It's not the deterrence of the law enforcement and throwing people to jail, but it does give us some deterrence capabilities. And so a lot of these interviews CISOs give on how we built a great SOC team and how we detect threats. Of course, don't say you're unbreakable, because that draws another type of attention, but it helps. It helps deter some groups. So I want to talk a little bit about the cloud, because everybody's moving to the cloud, right? And that's also what my day-to-day looks like. So this is one of the most interesting pieces of statistics that came out of IBM. So IBM, every year they add new questions to the questionnaire, remove older stuff that's not relevant anymore. And last year, so in 2022, so that's published in early 2023, they asked, was the data breach in the cloud? And in 2022, 45% of data breaches were in the cloud or had a cloud component. In 2023, that number jumped to 82%. So that's a huge jump. We can assume that going forward, this is going to be over 90%. And that's because, unlike what people think, attackers are not very sophisticated, they're not very smart, and they're not very advanced. So when a new technology is introduced, cloud, AI, we'll talk about that in a minute, the pen testers are all, oh, let's research that. We'll all spend time and energy and we'll discover all the fancy new attacks. But the attackers are taking their time. It's a business. They don't want to spend too much research. So only the last 2 years, the cloud attacks have been picking up, which is quite amazing. And then response in the cloud is difficult for now. And what we see is that when things are in the cloud, it's a little hard to read, but basically one is public cloud and one is hybrid public and private cloud. But the ones with the bigger bars are the ones that have cloud. Bigger bars because it's longer to detect, longer to respond, and with that, bigger financial impact. Again, very tightly coupled. It's harder to detect, it's harder to respond. Most SOC teams are not very good in the cloud. Again, this is my business. I speak with Gartner. A year ago, most SOC analysts in Gartner wouldn't even take my call. They're like, oh, cloud, we don't do cloud, right? Some people may find it funny, especially some of the more cloud-native companies. For the big companies, only now SOC teams last year or two are starting to really take control of cloud attacks. So longer to contain, more impactful, and this is a recent study by TechTarget, which now people are starting to understand that as well, right? So people understand that cloud requires different tools, different processes, need more context and data for cloud threat detection and response, because just the logs that are coming from the cloud are so complicated to deal with in a SIEM/SOC context, and just know that their existing tools aren't very effective. Last thing I want to talk about, AI. So AI is a wonderful thing. I think we all agree about it. It's an amazing technology, huge potential. And when AI started, everybody was talking about offensive AI and defensive AI, and is AI good or bad for what we just discussed about? And so the short answer is, the short-term answer is that AI is good for us. Right now, and this is some study by the FBI, claims that it favors defenders. Why does it favor defenders? Not because it inherently favors defenders. It favors defenders because what I mentioned before. We adopt security professionals, practitioners, companies, we adopt technologies faster than the attackers. So we are now adopting AI at an amazing pace. You look, we're in Innovation Sandbox on Monday, half the companies were AI companies. Everything's now AI security. Every company adds AI, and that helps us. And so it's very, very impactful and positive for detection and response. It's probably the one area where AI is the most significant. And we're all, as a vendor, we're all putting money into that. But I'm not sure it's going to stay that way. And again, it's early to tell. I'm no prophet. We are seeing preliminary indicators for use by attackers. For now, it's the naive, simple things, right? People use ChatGPT to write better phishing emails or to scout through your mailbox in business email compromise attacks to find the right ones, saving them some time. But they're not really, really building AI that creates sophisticated attacks and exploits in masses yet. It could happen. And when it will happen, it will magnify our problem because we have a symmetry problem, right? They need a lot less effort, than we need to succeed attacking versus defending. And so, we'll have to see, but it's going to be interesting as they adopt it. So, what do I do with all this great story that I told you today? Think about response. Think about it. There is no one answer for how to deal with it or what to do with it, but think about it. Think about what I talked about today. Map your gap in response maturity. I think that's the number one thing to look at. Did you think about it? Do you have response maturity? Do you have detection and prevention response capabilities? And then work on improving that, right? So automation, response automation, investigation automation, IR practices, AI capabilities. Level up your SOC, get them to the cloud because that's where things are coming. And continue working on that, detecting, testing that. A lot of red teams, we do a lot of red teams because we want to check our posture. A lot of times when people do red teams, they don't test their SOC. It's like, oh, there's a red team now. Yeah, you can just ignore that. That's the red team working. You shouldn't do that. When there's a red team, you should have your SecOps treat it as a real incident and try to block them. See how good they are at this, right? So we need to get this going. We need to get better at response, and that will make us not breach less, but have much smaller catastrophes when we are breached. Thank you. Questions?
It's Mohammed with the Hair Corporation. So my first question to you, how do you define response?
So to me, response is everything that starts after you detected that something happened, right? So it includes investigating, and there's this framework, of course, but investigating, containing, remediating, recovering, right? And so the foundation, once something happens, either if you know enough, you can immediately contain, but then you have to investigate because you have to understand the blast radius, how it happened, and then be able to do all the rest, the recovery and eradication.
So that means I need to invest more on the investigation and the recovery?
Yes.
Okay. So another one, so you said a statement about if they know that I have good detections and respond, they will not go after me.
It provides a deterrence element. I'm not saying they will not go after you, but it
so
can...
the thing is how they can know that, so that way they don't go after me.
Right, so...
It's just tricky.
It's tricky. So, some CISOs talk about it. Like they publish things. They're companies that have on their website, this is how we deal with incidents. Sure. This is what we do. And that's one way. Another way is to have technology in place. So when they start probing, they see indicators that you have good detection. You start blocking them. They get a feeling of, oh, somebody's not, I can't just scan, port scan everything for hours, I get blocked at some point, right? So,
Beautiful. Thank you.
sure. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. I'm here if anybody wants to talk to me in private.